Fellowship Awards, and I titled this talk Navigating Your Way Through the Valleys of Failure and Across the Peaks of Success, and I'll explain that slightly long-winded title in a moment. So let's get going. So on this talk, I've tried to keep my slides limited to about half an hour of talking, so that we've got plenty of time for discussion and questions after the presentation, because I think this particular topic is the sort of thing where people have lots of very specific individual experiences, but actually it's quite helpful if you have any specific questions, because it may be that there's someone else who's having similar thoughts or similar questions. So do feel free to chuck questions in the chat whilst the talk's going on, and then we'll go through them at the end. So over the next half hour, I will tell you a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me, and then we'll go through the different stages of applying for fellowship applications. I'll discuss some fellowship application do's and don'ts, and also talk a little bit about dealing with feedback, which I think is quite an important thing to consider when you're applying for fellowships. We'll also touch on how to prepare for interviews, and then kind of finish up with just thinking about whether or not you should actually apply for a fellowship. So I said I'd explain the talk. When I was asked to do this masterclass, I was just about to go off on a mini holiday cycling in the French Alps, and this is because it's one of my pastimes. One of my favorite things to do is cycle. I wouldn't say cycling up mountains is necessarily one of my favorite things to do, but for some mad, crazy reason, I do try and do it from time to time. And these are a few pictures, absolutely beautiful pictures from my trip this year. The reason it's pertinent for this particular talk is cycling up mountains is really hard. And this is a stage from the Tour de France, and you can see that there are 3 absolutely massive mountains that the riders have to climb up, and we, on our trip in the summer, we climbed up some similar mountains. And applying for a fellowship is a little bit like climbing up a mountain on a bike. It is not a particularly pleasant experience, and it requires a lot of hard work, but when you get to the top, it is incredibly satisfying. And when you actually get to do the fellowship, it does feel a bit like going down a mountain, in the sense that it's very exciting and it gives you lots of opportunities which you wouldn't normally be afforded if you didn't have a fellowship. It's also slightly terrifying and goes ridiculously quickly, and before you know it, you're back at the bottom of the mountain and you're in a position where you need to start again and apply for another fellowship. So I will tell you a little bit about my journey, and hopefully explain why I was asked to give this presentation. So I started out life as a sport and exercise scientist, and I got my degree from Birmingham in 2006. And after doing that, I actually went straight into a PhD in cardiovascular physiology, which I also did in Birmingham. And I finished that in 2010, at which point I wasn't overly excited about continuing a life in academia, partly because my PhD hadn't gone quite as well as I'd hoped it might do. But whilst I was trying to find a new career to go into, a job came up in Birmingham in the Department of Primary Care. So I took that thinking I can do this whilst I'm deciding what I really want to do. And I actually really enjoyed that first job working in primary care, and particularly the applied nature. And I'm sure you guys will all agree that working in academic primary care is a really exciting place to be. And it's I think one of the things that really motivates me is the idea that you're doing research which could actually have a benefit to real people in the real world. So following that first postdoc in Birmingham, I then moved to Oxford in 2013. And I've been in Oxford ever since, and it's quite scary to think I've been here for more than a decade. And during this time in Birmingham and in Oxford, I've developed research interests around management of hypertension. So originally, I did some work around out of office blood pressure measurement in a primary care setting. So thinking about measuring blood pressure at home and using 24-hour devices. And then I developed an interest in trying to better understand the benefits and harms of treatments for blood pressure, particularly how those benefits and harms change as people get older and develop frailty. And then kind of most recently, I've been doing some work around management of hypertension in older adults. And during this period of the last 14 years, I have applied for a lot of fellowships, and this is my fellowship application history. I've applied for 9 fellowships overall, and you can see that at each stage that I've applied for fellowships, it's not been a kind of chuck an application in and instantly successful. I've actually had to apply for quite a few, and for the most part, I've been pretty unsuccessful. So of the 9 applications that I've submitted, I've only been successful in 3 of them. So you can see actually the first people to reject me was the NIHR School for Primary Care Research. And I didn't ever bother going back to them for fellowship funding, although I have been lucky enough to get some project funding from the SPCR since. So in 2012, I got the MRC fellowship, which was actually the fellowship that took me to Oxford, and that lasted for 3 years. I'll talk a little bit more about what that involved, what that fellowship included. In 2016, I applied for 2 fellowships and was unsuccessful in both. I got shortlisted for interview for the NIHR, but then was unsuccessful following interview. And that led me to apply to NIHR again and Wellcome Trust in 2017. And I was lucky enough to be successful with the Wellcome Trust. And I actually had the enviable position of turning around to the NIHR and saying I didn't actually want to go to interview that they shortlisted me for because I've been successful with the Wellcome application. And then in 2023, I applied to Wellcome again and was unsuccessful after interview. But luckily, I had also applied for NIHR and was able to secure an NIHR fellowship. Finally, after 5 attempts, I managed to get some funding from the NIHR. And in many ways, my fellowship journey is kind of matched that of a Tour de France stage. So the uphill struggle of 3 applications to get the MRC fellowship, followed by an enjoyable downhill period where I did the fellowship. Then I had those 2 unsuccessful applications before the Wellcome Trust Fellowship in 2017. Again, another period of downhill as I did the Wellcome Trust Fellowship, and then most recently my attempts to get an NIHR, the most recent NIHR fellowship. So when you're thinking about applying for a fellowship, there's lots of things you need to consider. But the first thing is just to think about whether you are at the right stage to apply. And the most important thing is really whether your CV is up to scratch. And I imagine a lot of you will be at different stages in your career, and you'll see that I've applied for 3 fellowships over my career. And obviously those fellowships have been quite different depending on my career stage. So typically what they say is they want to see evidence that the applicant is on a strong upward trajectory. And this is usually judged primarily on publications and evidence of funding. But that's kind of proportional to where you are in your career stage. So if you're an early postdoc, you will be expected to have some publications, and maybe 1 small grant on your career, on your CV. Whereas if you're at a more senior stage, you'll be expected to have several, many publications, including those in high impact journals, and maybe a few larger grants to demonstrate that you're kind of on that upward trajectory. And I think it's important to think about this, but it's also worth saying that when I got my NIHR fellowship, I was looking back at the original fellowship application, preparing these slides. I think I had 4 papers published. One of those was a study protocol. And then I actually put in a load of papers that were in press or in preparation just to try and make my CV look a little bit more substantial. But the key thing that I had, which I think helped me at that stage, was I had a paper in the BMJ, which was obviously very fortunate. But I remember getting feedback on that first fellowship application set along the lines of, this guy's not got very many papers, but the ones he's got are good quality. So it's not always about the number of papers you've got. Sometimes having quality over quantity is quite important, particularly in those early stages, and it's worth thinking about as you're writing papers in the early stages of your career. The other thing to think about is, what is it you want to achieve by getting your fellowship? So thinking about your stage of career and what you've done up until now, and what could you do during a fellowship which would help you develop. And one of the problems I've had in the past is saying that I'm going to do loads of different research methods which don't really link up with one another. So there's no point doing having a long history of doing stats research and then saying that you're going to do a fellowship in qualitative research. You might want to do, what you need to think about is having a sort of clear plan for how you're developing yourself. So if you've got a long history of quantitative or statsy methods, you might want to build on that rather than going to something completely different. And then the final thing to think about is whether or not you've got support from your supervisor in your department, and that is really important. And I think without proper support from a supervisor, I think it's really difficult to get these, and I've certainly benefited from having really good support from a supervisor who pushed me to put these applications in, even when I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about doing so. So if you've decided to do a fellowship application, I'm pretty sure everybody on this call probably has decided that. The next thing to think about is, what do you put in that application? And if you read guidance, they'll talk about, or talk to people on panels, they'll talk about person, project and place. So are you a candidate with a strong track record or someone with a positive upward trajectory? And that's usually based on what you've got on your CV. Do you have a strong project that's aligned to the funder aims? You'll see that I've applied to various different funders over the years, and each are looking for a slightly different thing. And sometimes you need to tailor the way you frame your project to make sure that it matches with what the funders are expecting. And then finally, the place. And the place is obviously where you're planning to do the fellowship, but it's also it also might be who you're planning to collaborate with. So often a nice thing to include in a fellowship is spending some time at another institution where you can learn some different research methods or learn about a particular clinical topic that you're interested in moving into. And so having a host department, I mean, if you're in the SPCR, you're probably in a department which has got a good track record for primary care research. So you can so it's important to emphasize that. But then if you can also say, I'm going to go and spend a month working in another institution in the UK or abroad, that always makes for a stronger application. And then the key thing to think about is, what do you want to be in 10 years' time? And I think applying for a fellowship, if nothing else, even if you're not successful in applying for a fellowship, it is a useful exercise in just forcing you to think about what it is you want to do with your career. Where do you want to be in 10 years' time? What kind of researcher do you want to be? And I think I've really benefited from being forced to think about that every 3 years as I've gone about doing my applications. And it's quite difficult to do it initially, but as you do it more, it's easier to come up with a kind of coherent story of what you've done to date and how you want to develop as a researcher. And it's not just useful for doing it for fellowship applications, it's also useful for thinking about job applications, promotion applications, all these kind of things. The more you do it, the more slick your kind of story becomes, and the more believable it becomes. So I think it's really important to think about that. And certainly when I started out doing fellowship applications, I said I wanted to be a quantitative researcher, so I wanted to do statsy type things. As I moved into my second fellowship, I kind of made a conscious decision that I wanted to make better use of electronic health record data and become an expert in using routine data for research. And the other area I've always had a desire to be work in is clinical trials. So my first fellowship, I included training in clinical trials, and then subsequently have included funding for doing clinical trials in my funding applications. So yeah, that's just that's the basics of what you should be thinking about when you're planning your fellowship application. This is just to kind of detail exactly what I ended up doing. So of the three fellowships that I've had, they've obviously been at different career stages, and that's been reflected in what I've included in those. So my first fellowship was all about finding what my specialty was going to be and developing some methodological skills which I didn't have previously. Remember, I started out life as a sports scientist, so when I came into academic primary care, I was almost starting from scratch, and so I needed lots of training and skill methods development in order to get myself to be where I wanted to be. So in that MRC fellowship, I included training in stats and clinical trials. And the project that I decided to do was basically an IPD analysis of previous blood pressure measurement studies, which I used to develop a prediction tool. And so my training, the skills training that I got, was complemented by the project that I said I was going to deliver. The second fellowship that I did was much more of a mid-career fellowship, so I could demonstrate that I'd been successful in certain things previously. And the main thing I articulated in that second fellowship was that I wanted to transition to an independent researcher. So I wanted to establish my own research team, and I wanted to kind of really learn more advanced research methods building on what I'd done previously. So I framed it around using big data to really develop skills in specific types of statistics, so prediction modeling and causal inference epidemiology. And my project was a CPRD study looking at the harms of antihypertensive therapy using those two methods specifically in the projects. And then the most recent fellowship that I applied for last year was more about developing as a leader and establishing an international reputation in what I do. Again, learning more advanced research methods. So I wanted to continue to develop as an applied health data scientist, and having done lots of statistics, I then my main kind of goals in this new fellowship are to learn more advanced machine learning methods, and also develop as a research leader. So I've got lots of training in there and some coaching around research leadership. And again, my plan is to do some work with the CPRD, exploring adverse drug events this time using those new methods that I'll be developing. So the training, so one of the important things is you shouldn't just, when with a fellowship, it's more than just a project grant, and as important is the training plan that you include to complement your project. And so I think it's really important to give this a lot of careful thought, and you will definitely get quizzed on your training plan if you get shortlisted for interview. And my training, and I think it's important to think not just about methods development, but also think about your own personal development, so the leadership skills, and also other things related to applied research, so training in public engagement with policy. I've had the opportunity to do all of those things as part of previous fellowships that I've done. And I think a key element of training plan is also looking to work with other collaborators and potentially visit other institutions across this country and also abroad. And certainly in my first two fellowships, I had links with other institutions where I went over and spent a bit of time, maybe just for a week or two, working in another group, learning about how they did their research. So the next thing that you obviously need to think about when you're planning your fellowship is your costings. And I know when I first did my first couple of fellowship applications, I had absolutely no idea what you would include in a costing for a fellowship. So I wanted to just give a few ideas for those of you who are doing this for the first time. My first bit of advice would be to include as much staff time as possible. So that's your staff time, time for you, but also if the fellowship allows, any extra time for staff to support you in your project. The more staff you can involve, the more research you can do, and the more successful your fellowship will be. But when you're doing that, also think about the type of staff that you want to employ on your fellowship. So if you're doing a clinical trial, certainly in Oxford anyway, if you do a clinical trial, you need to work with the CTU, which is great, but you won't necessarily have line management responsibility for those staff. So you'll be able to deliver a big project, but you won't necessarily learn the skills around building your own team. So in my fellowships, I've always included staff that would be specifically line managed by myself. And in fact, the trial work that we've done has always been funded separately, not through my fellowships, because part of the fellowship aims have been to build my own research group. Thinking also about the research costs and sort of value, how the fellowship will be viewed in terms of value for money. If you put a big trial in your fellowship, it's going to be very expensive, and so you're going to need to justify that. The fellowships that I've done, which have used secondary analysis of data or CPRD data cuts, the research costs are much smaller, and so it's a bit easier to argue that it's good value for money. The other thing I would say is be very specific about the training course costs. So don't just say I'm going to do leadership training. Go and find some leadership training specifically and cost the exact amount of it. Same if you're doing methods development. You're going to do a prediction modeling course, decide which prediction modeling course you want to do and cost it specifically. It just shows the panel and the reviewers that you've thought about it carefully and you're taking it seriously. The other thing I would advise is to make sure you include plenty of funding for travel opportunities, if that's something that you want to do. Fellowships are a great way to see the world and go to some really cool places. And I've been lucky enough to go all over the world funded through my fellowships. And I would say it's probably one of the biggest perks of getting these kinds of things. You get to go to places that you just wouldn't be able to go to if you didn't have funding from a fellowship. Also think about mentoring and coaching costs, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And also think about what additional support you can get from your department. So that's not costings, that's matched funding or things that you can say that this is what the department will do for me if you fund this fellowship, and I'll show you what I mean here. So these are the kind of things that I included in my previous fellowships, and you can see how they vary depending on the career stage and the duration of the fellowship. So in my first early postdoc fellowship, I was only able to cost time for myself, but I was able to put in quite a generous amount for travel and conferences for just a 3-year fellowship, and likewise for training courses. At that stage, I didn't ask my department for any additional support, and that was mainly because it didn't really occur to me, but also I think in order to get support from your department, you need to have justified that you're worth the investment. And I was quite new in the department at the point at which I was applying for this, so I didn't feel like I was in a position to ask for that. When I went for my Wellcome Fellowship, they were quite generous, staff support, and likewise for travel and conferences and training. And because I'd already had a fellowship, I felt in a stronger position to go to my department and say, would you support a PhD studentship if I was successful in this award? And they agreed to that. And then most recently, you can see that actually for the NIHR, they're not as generous with staff, even though this is a more senior fellowship. But they have allowed quite a lot of money for training courses. At this stage, not just for me, but also for me to develop my team. And because this was my third fellowship, I felt in a much stronger position to go to my department and ask for additional support. So they were agreed to match fund the staff on the fellowship. And I also got them to commit to providing me with a permanent position. And I would really encourage you to do that. That last one, get them to commit to a permanent position. I should have done it when I applied for my Wellcome Fellowship, and I wasn't confident enough to do so. But I think after 2 fellowships, I was in a good position to ask for that. The problem is, once you've got the fellowship, you're in much less of a stronger bargaining position, or at least certainly if you're towards the end of it. What you should do is ask for it up front, and it's a lot easier for a department to agree to something when they don't even know if it's ever going to come to fruition. So I would encourage you to be brave in that respect and ask for the department support. The worst case scenario is they say no, but you don't really lose anything else. So fellowship application dues. Absolutely begin planning early. There's no point starting a fellowship application after with 3 months to go before the deadline, because you'll never be able to pull together everything into a sensible application. I typically start thinking about them probably 1.5 years before I'm actually going to apply, and I'm definitely actively working on them up to 12 months before the deadline. Think carefully about, as we said, how your future career might look and how the fellowship might allow you to achieve this. And this is probably one of the hardest things in a fellowship. You need to talk about how great you are. And I would say if you're not uncomfortable with the extent to which you've bigged yourself up, you probably haven't bigged yourself up enough. Funders are looking to support the next generation of kind of international leading professors, and so if you can't talk about yourself as that, it's unlikely that they'll believe that you're capable of it. I feel like certainly in Britain we're not very good at bragging about ourselves, but you really do need to do it. And like I say, all of my fellowship applications, I cringe when I read them, and that's probably the level that you need to do it at. And in that respect, I would encourage you to look at other people's applications to see how they've done it and talk to them about their experiences. And I think most people who've gone through this process are usually quite happy to share previous applications to help people who are applying, especially for the first time. Continuing on things that you should do, think about it as a long multi-application process. So you'll see my first attempts, I needed to apply for 3 fellowships before I was successful. The second time round, I applied for 4 until I was successful. And most recently, I had 2 applications before I was successful. I think it's so easy to give up after the first knockback, but I think you just have to, I try to expect that I'm going to be unsuccessful and already have another application either submitted or in the mix, so that as soon as you get rejected, you've got something else to hang your hat on. Obviously, support from senior colleagues is really important, and find people that you like working with. I think academia is difficult at times, and having people that you enjoy spending time with and working with really helps you get through those difficult times. And if you've got lots of senior colleagues who are willing to support you, they can provide feedback throughout the fellowship process, and that's really important in terms of getting a good application together. And kind of allied to that, get yourself a mentor or 2, and also think about leadership coaching as you move to some more senior levels. And by a mentor, I'm talking about someone who's experienced and can act as a trusted advisor, but who has no vested interest in your work, and their only objective should be to see you to succeed. So a mentor is not someone who would be a collaborator or on your research, that you typically wouldn't be writing papers with them or submitting grants with them. They're completely independent, and so they can give you independent advice without any kind of vested interest in whether you do a certain project or not. And mentors can be internal or external to your institution. I think it's actually quite good to have both, if you can. And when I was doing my fellowship MRC fellowship, I was lucky enough to have access to the Academy of Medical Sciences mentoring scheme. And they can link you up with people all over the country who are geared up to be mentors. Quite senior professors. They're all basically fellows of the Academy of Medical Sciences, but they also offer training for both the mentor and the mentee about how to do it properly. And I've benefited a lot from my mentoring relationships that I've had through the Academy. It's not open to everyone, so I think typically you have to be funded by by specific funders in order to apply to the Academy of Medical Sciences. But there are loads of other mentoring schemes out there. I think Society for Academic Primary Care has a mentoring scheme. We did have some mentoring schemes in the SPCR a few years ago, but I'm not sure if that still exists. But you don't have to go through a formal mentoring scheme. You can even ask your supervisor or colleagues if they can recommend anyone to be a mentor, and kind of go through informal routes. But I would really encourage you to do it because it's really useful. Fellowship application, don't be too broad in what you propose to do. Don't do what I did for one of my NIHR applications, which was say I'm going to do stuff in stats, genetics, health economics, and big data, because you'll be told that that's way too broad and it's not really hitting a sort of coherent story about what you want to be as a researcher. I was always told you have to move institutions if you want to be do a fellowship. I've never said that I'm going to move institutions to do a fellowship. I did move an institution once, but that was after I'd got the fellowship. The important thing is that you're in the best place that you could be in order to deliver the type of research you want to do. So as long as you can demonstrate that your department is going to support you and has the sort of methodological expertise to do so, I think it's okay. And you can, even if linked to that is, if you are going to stay in the same institution, don't have all your collaborators in the same institution as well. Try and have collaborators in different places. And then finally, don't be disheartened by negative feedback. And this is really important because if you're going to start applying for fellowships, you are going to get negative feedback. And sometimes the feedback is constructive and helpful, and sometimes it won't be. And that's why you need to have good mentors and good senior colleagues who can help you to distinguish between the two. And it's not easy to deal with negative feedback, but unfortunately it is par for the course and something that you've got to get used to in academia. And I think you have to, well, my approach has always been to anticipate that I'm going to fail and have a strategy to deal with it. And certainly with fellowships, because you can apply for multiple fellowships at the same time, I've always tried to do that so that if one's unsuccessful, I've always got another option on the horizon. It's worth saying that getting negative feedback doesn't mean that you are a bad researcher. And I just wanted to share the feedback from my first NIHR fellowship application, which was about as bad as you could possibly get. So, but every aspect of the fellowship, it was judged as uncompetitive. And their summary of the application was that I was a poor candidate with a poor application. And some of the specific feedback I got on it was, do not attempt stats training. That was basically what the fellowship was about. They slagged off my PhD, saying that it wasn't very good. They said that it wasn't efficient to train an applicant in statistics in this way, and it was questionable about whether it'd be worth funding the statistical courses I put in. And then this was my favourite bit of feedback. I don't know how this could ever be useful or constructive for someone, but they said the statistical analyses would be better done by a competent statistician in perhaps a month rather than a weak social scientist. So that was what I had to deal with after my first fellowship. But because I had my MRC application already in the mix, and I had some very good support from colleagues, I was able to get past this. And in fact, my MRC application was very similar to this NIHR application, and it was successful. So it shows that even when you get this sort of feedback, it doesn't mean that it's correct or the end of the world. And then finally, just to finish off, thinking about if you're shortlisted for interview, just a few tips would be organise as many mock interviews as you can with as many different people as you can, and make sure that at least one of them is face to face, because chances are you'll have to do your actual interview face to face. And during these mock interviews, ask your colleagues to be really horrible to you. Ask them to interrupt you and make you feel as uncomfortable as possible. And I would say my mock interviews over the years have always been way worse than the actual interview itself. And in fact, I to the extent I actually get quite nervous about mock interviews. I feel the kind of physical response of anxiety. I get sweaty, I get hot and stressed by just doing a mock interview. And I think that's a good thing, because it really does prepare you for the real thing, which often feels much more straightforward. And one of the ways that I prepare for the interview is to think of every possible question I could get asked about my application. I write them all down, and then I write down a model answer to those questions. And more often than not, you're able to think of the kind of questions that you end up getting asked, but it means that when you're asked them, you're not kind of stood there slightly thrown about how to respond. And then the other thing to think about is you'll probably have to give a presentation during your interview. And for presentations, even now, I write a very specific script about exactly what I want to say, and I memorize that so that I can deliver it perfectly on the day. And the reason that's important is the presentation is the first thing that you'll do during your interview, and if you can nail that, it gives you a lot of confidence when you then go into the questions. If you've got to travel for the interview, like NIHR, for example, is up in Leeds, think about whether you should travel on the day, or if it's early in the morning, think about getting overnight accommodation. And then the final thing I would say is aim for an interview, just aim to do yourself justice. There's lots of things that you can control in an interview, but you cannot control the outcome. And there's no point stressing about what the outcome might be. And the one interview where I really cocked it up was when I was too hung up on how important it was that I got the fellowship and how I needed it in order to kind of continue my career in academia. And that meant it got the better of me on that occasion, and I was unsuccessful. Whereas if you just go in aiming to nail your presentation and answer the questions to the best of your ability, I think it's a much better mindset. And if you can leave the interview feeling like you did yourself justice, then you should be happy and not worry about what else happens after that. So just to finish, should you apply for a fellowship? Well, applying for fellowships is hard, it's demoralizing, and doing interviews, I'm not going to lie, is really unpleasant experience. However, and you should only really apply if you're ready, so make sure that you've got a good CV and a coherent research plan. But a fellowship is the best way to progress your career and develop as an independent researcher. And just going back to my cycling analogy, I would say getting a fellowship is a bit like blood doping in sport. It gives you almost an unfair advantage over all of your peers, because you just are able to spend so much time and have so much more resource to do what you want to do. It really will kind of boost your career in a way that no other type of funding will do. And it also provides fantastic opportunities to travel and learn from experts in your field. And it really is a privilege to hold a fellowship, and ultimately makes you a better researcher and academia. So I would say you should apply for a fellowship if you're ready. And as long as you're prepared to go through the difficulty of that application process, I think it is ultimately a very rewarding experience. And the final thing to say is, although these are personal awards, they're really not done by one person. And I've had the benefit of working with some really fantastic researchers over the years, without whose help I would never have been able to be successful in any of those fellowship applications. So yeah, it really is a team effort. And that is pretty much all I had to say. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening. And I wonder if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you, James. Take questions in the chat just yet.
maybe I've just bamboozled everyone, or
if it's okay with you, James, shall I unmute Leanne? And
yeah, of course, yeah.
Hi, James. Thanks so much for a fantastic talk. I'm Leanne Wood. I'm a probably early to mid-career researcher, and I've got a fellowship at the moment with NIHR primary care. And one of the questions I'm looking at going for one of the NIHR advanced fellowships, and someone asked me the other day, why not a grant as opposed to a fellowship? And I suppose my question to you would be, do you think it is better to go down the fellowship route in terms of kind of continuing to build your research independence and training? And do you mean, like, when do you become expert enough to feel that you're competent to lead grants, as opposed to continue to get fellowships to build your own expertise and independence?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's your colleague who asked you that question it's a really good idea to ask that question, because the fellowship is only worth going for if you've got specific training needs that you want to kind of build on. So the problem with a project grant is you're expected to already be the kind of finished article and be able to deliver that project. And it really depends on what type of project it is. So I think even as a early mid-career researcher, you can make a case for saying that I can lead a project grant. You can submit grants to the RFPB, for example, around a specific project. I think if you're trying to lead bigger grants, particularly ones that involve different elements, I think you do need to be more senior, and that's the sort of thing where you might say to say in a fellowship, I want to be able to lead a trial, or I want to be able to lead a program grant which involves lots of different elements which I'm not expert in at all. And one of the things that I've come unstuck on in the past is saying, ultimately I want to lead a trial which has got a qualitative evaluation in and a health economic component, and I've gone and submitted a fellowship application with quality training and health economics because I've said that I want to lead research that involves this, and people have said, but you're a quantitative statsy researcher, why are you putting that stuff in? So you don't always need to be an expert in everything that you're leading in, but I think you do need to have a basic understanding of these types of things. So for a fellowship, I would say it's all about the training development that you're going to get in addition to doing the important research project. If the research project you want to do, you're already pretty coherent and have good expertise in being able to deliver it, then perhaps a project grant is actually the better place to go.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. So we do have a few questions in the chat now. First question is, did you find collaborating internationally helpful for applications?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think well, first of all, it looks really strong from a reviewer point of view. I think if you've got lots of collaborators across the world, I think it looks like you're ultimately they're looking to fund people who are going to become international leaders in a field, and in order to do that you need to work with people internationally. In my first fellowship application, the MRC one, I basically got data sets from lots of different projects, including some projects that have been done in the US and Canada. And I went over to Canada to meet the guys who'd been working on the project, and they shared the data with me, which back in those days was a lot easier because it was pre-GDPR. I used those data to develop a prediction tool, and then I validated it using some other data sets. And all of that looked good from a kind of fellowship point of view, but it was genuinely helpful to me because it allowed me to create a tool which wasn't just very kind of England or UK centric, but it's also the way they do things in different countries is very different from how they do things here. So you learn a lot, I think, from working with international collaborators as well. I hope that answers your question there.
Thank you, James. How do you organise spending time at different institutions? How do you cost this, arrange this?
Good question. Yeah, so it will vary from institution to institution. So for my Wellcome Fellowship, I said I was going to spend some time at, it was called the FAR Institute at that point. I think they're the Health Institute for Health Informatics now at UCL in London. And for that, I had various conversations with Harry Hemingway, who was the head of the institute at that time. And we did cost in some admin time for spending time at that institute. I think I costed it in at working there 1 day a week for the equivalent of 2 years, so just under 6 months of a kind of placement. If you came to work in the department in primary care, for example, we have bench fees that we charge. I can't remember exactly how much it is, but essentially find someone that you can collaborate with in that other institution. Think about a specific project or something specific you could do there, and then ask them if there are any costs that are associated with it, and it will depending on the institution.
Thank you, James. How did you justify the international visits, collaborators, if there are some local, i.e. UK-based options available as well?
Well, you can't justify it if there are some UK-based collaborators who could offer the same thing. I think you have to just frame it in a way that even if there's people that are doing similar types of research, you can say that in different settings. I mean, you think about primary care, for example. Primary care looks very different across Europe, across the United States compared to what it's like here. So you can make a case for even just understanding how you do primary care research studies in those different places might be worth learning about, particularly if you want to. I mean, in a fellowship, I would talk about wanting to establish an international kind of reputation in a certain thing. And in order to do that, you need to learn about how your particular clinical area or area of interest, how it works in those different settings. But it is an important thing to think about. If there's someone who is an expert in the particular thing you're talking about on your doorstep, it may or may not get picked up at peer review, but if it does, then you could be in a bit of trouble. So you do need to justify that.
And we have a question from Jack, thanking you for your amazing presentation, and a question about your team science slide. At what point and how should you vary building and recruiting such a big team? How to recruit collaborators and at what stage? As it seems a challenge getting people on side.
Yeah, so I would say that slide at the end wasn't all people who work for me. They're people who I have worked with. I think my experience is actually most people are pretty up for collaborating. I've only had a few occasions where I've emailed people and asked if they'd like to be involved in something, and they've said no. I think with a fellowship, it's quite clear straight up that people are offering to help you without necessarily getting anything back. You can't cost for co-applicants on a fellowship application. So usually people are quite clear on that just by the fact that you're asking for some help with a fellowship. Essentially you want people who are going to add value to the fellowship. So you want to think about people who are going to add value in terms of the methods that you're planning to use, people who are going to add value in terms of the clinical area that you're planning to work in. And the slide I put up, that's kind of 10 years of people that I've come across working with. So it's not something that you do overnight. But if I'm honest, most of those people I have either been introduced to through colleagues that I'm already working with, or I've just emailed out of the blue and said, "Hi, I'm James. I'm doing this work. Would you be interested in working with me on something?" And like I say, I think more often than not, people are positive. And it's the same as I said earlier. What's the worst that can happen? Someone doesn't reply to your email. It's not really the end of the world. You don't have to give anything away in that initial approach, but often people will respond, and it can develop into a really fruitful relationship.
Thank you. And should you budget to pay mentors for their time?
No, definitely not. I don't think that's ever appropriate. Again, mentors shouldn't have any sort of vested interest, and I would say paying them is kind of not appropriate. Where you might consider including budget is for a coach. So coaches are professional coaches are people who are there to help you navigate through different challenges. And so my last fellowship, I paid for a leadership coach who helped me kind of through some of the challenges that I had around sort of building a team and line managing people for the first time. And for them, you do need to budget a time, but certainly not for mentors, no.
Thank you, James. There's a question here about why you costed yourself 100% FTE for your NIHR Advanced Fellowship, greater than 100%.
Yes, less than 100%. Yeah, I should have mentioned that, actually. That's a good point. So the main reason for that was that I have other projects that I'm doing at the moment, which are already costed my time for the next few years. And so you can't cost more than 100% of your time, particularly if it's on multiple NIHR grants. And also it made the application a bit cheaper. So you always constantly need to think about value for money when you're putting these fellowships together, and almost definitely you'll get some reviewer who says this is not value for money. So you have to account for everything. And if by costing myself at 75%, it made the application cheaper essentially. So it looks better value for money. I'm doing a trial at the moment which costs 20% of my time, and then I'm a co-op on a few other grants, so can easily make up that extra 25%. And I kind of basically argued in the fellowship that I would continue to have 25% of my time working on other projects, and it just gives you the flexibility to be involved in other stuff as well.
And I think
what you've just said
there, James, answers Bethan's question.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say yes, it is worth doing that. Although I think it felt more appropriate for a senior fellowship rather than a more junior one. So I think if I'd have costed my MRC fellowship at 75%, people would have come back and said, this guy's not committed to delivering his research fellowship. He should be doing this 100% of the time. I think when you become more senior, there's more of an expectation that you'll be involved in other stuff at the same time. So it's a bit more acceptable.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. We don't have any further questions in the chat. So unless anyone's got anything to add. Thank you very much, James. I think
no problem. I
that's
hope
been really useful.
Great. Yeah, I hope it is helpful. Obviously my experience is very different from other people's, so yeah, I can only really sort of talk to my own experience, but like I say, I do think I've been very lucky to have these fellowships over the years, and I would encourage people to go for it. And also not just think about NIHR. There are lots of other fellowship options